Chapter 3. I seldom saw Yeshua after that day. He preferred to be alone. He had dreams to dream, plans to make. He had to prepare himself to move and shake the world. Once I found him atop a high hill, staring sightlessly in the direction of Mount Tabor. "Yeshu," I said to him, for I too had learned to call him what the Galileans did, their corruption of the Aramaic short form Yeshu, for Yeshuas. But he didn't answer me. I called him 2 or 3 more times. He sat there, dreaming. I could see his lips move. "Abba," he whispered. "Father." I was frightened then. For all my skepticism, I let the thought that a demon had entered him cross my mind. I shook him hard. "Yeshu," I said. His eyes cleared. He stared at me with sorrowful anger. "Leave me alone, Nathan," he said. "I'm talking to my Father." But, Yeshua, your Father isn't here. We're alone. He looked at me, and the sorrow at my incomprehension that showed in his eyes deepened, became actual pain. "We're never alone, Nathan," he said gravely. "My Father is always here. Always. Wherever his children are, wait for me down below. What he has to tell me is not for other ears." I turned then and went down the slope. It was practically impossible to disobey him, even then. As I lopped downward, I met the woman coming up it. She was as broad as the earth, as dark as fecund. She toiled upward past me, her lined heavy face twisted with worry, sorrow, with something close to anguish even. Then she saw him. "Yeshu," she cried out, and her voice was a temple gong, bronze-toned, almost golden. "Oh, Yeshu, my son, my son!" He didn't answer her. He went on with his dialogue with nothing. "Yeshu!" she wept. "Oh, Heavenly Father, you who look upon so small a thing as Tazar Bel Hayim, the distress of animals, what have I done that you take away my firstborn's wits?" He turned his eyes upon her. They were cold with contempt. That was one of the many ironies of his life. He and Miriam never got along. Never. And now they confuse her with Isis. Make her. But no. I go too fast. "Leave me, Mother," he said quietly. "I'm talking to my Father." She hung there, her big body rigid with shock. "Your Father?" she said. "Your Father is at home. Worn out and sick, working to support us, including you. You, idler. Jacob does all he can to help him, but he hasn't your skill. Yosi, Shimeon, and Yehuda are too little yet, the girls of no use, a burden, and you. And I am here, talking with my Father, my real Father, who has other concerns beside ox goads and plowshares. Leave me, Mother. I must be about my Father's business. Don't ask me what it is. You wouldn't understand. It isn't of this world." She started to scream at him, then to berate him, but he had closed his ears to her, as he had long since closed his mind, his heart. I didn't want to hear it, so I went on down the hill. But I've often wondered if Yeshua's unbending harshness towards the sins of the flesh was not born of the wall of mutual incomprehension between him and his mother. I loved mine past all bearing as a child, so when I was of age, that love extended itself easily and passionately to other members of her sex. Yeshua's was kind to women, but only because he hadn't it in him to be unkind to any living creature for very long, and they adored him, especially the mind-sick ones like Miriam of Migdal Nun Aya, that howling madwoman from the lovely lakeshore town which the Romans, with their constitutional incapacity for getting our names right, call Magdala. But he never loved a woman. Never. I'd swear he went innocent of female flesh down to his very grave. No love is innocent. There does not exist a relation between man and woman that does not have its deep-hidden, graying ember of carnality, stubbornly aglow. Not even my love for my mother. There is no friendship between man and man that does not have its twisted skein of unknowing, unacknowledged, perverted love. Not even my love hate for Yeshua's. I write both these things with no intent to shock. I am trying to set down truth, and that is very hard. For on the day I sailed away to Athens to begin my studies there, my uncle Hezron came down to the port of Joppa to see me off. Naturally, my mother and my father both were there. My father was full of fun, making his sly little jokes, begging my uncle to say a special long-faced Perusian prayer, that I should not fall prey to Aphrodite. My uncle muttered something into his bushy beard. Then he saw how my mother was weeping. "Don't cry, Elisheba," he murmured, and reaching out, he took her hand. A look flashed between them. That was all. But if at that moment I had a blade, I would have plunged it through my uncle's heart. The result of my youthful jealousy was disastrous. It tipped the scales in favor of my father's influence over me. I cursed my uncle Hezron in my heart, called him pious hypocrite, would-be betrayer of his brother, would-be, because even then I was not fool enough to believe he'd tried to seduce my mother, or that he ever would. Of course, I told myself, she'd send him packing if... But then I remembered her answering look, and my insides came apart. Fool. What I've arrived at since only lends splendor to them both. What other man and woman have I ever known who could or would have done what my mother and uncle did, which was to suffer lifelong a great and terrible love, and honor God and themselves by quietly keeping to their separate ways? In Athens, I ran wild. I came back a polished, perfect, Hellenized Jew, which is the type, form, description, and epitome of bastardy. Has not Saul or Paul of Tarsus proved that fully? Did I learn anything of importance there? Little. From the heterai to be bold with women, to chatter away in easy, fluent Greek, from my Roman classmates a reasonable command over Latin. Strange, it was the Latin that served me best of all. And upon my return, instead of passing the summer as usual at my uncle's house, I took up my abode at Tiberias, the capital that Herod Antipas had built near the warm springs of Emmaus, on the western bank of Lake Gennesareth, surely the loveliest spot in all Galilee. I chose that city out of pure gleeful malice, knowing it was the one place on earth where my pious, God-fearing Uncle Hezron could never visit me. For, While the excavations were being made to lay the foundations of the beautiful Grecian temples and official buildings that Antipas caused to be erected there, the spades of the slaves turned up so many human bones that it immediately became apparent the spot was the site of an ancient necropolis or cemetery, which meant that no pious Jew could live there or even enter the city, for merely by setting foot upon such ground he became ritually unclean. Antipas, therefore, had been forced to gather in a rabble of foreigners and such Jews as could be induced or forced to take residence in his capital. Naturally, under such circumstances, the Jews of Tiberias were the dregs and scum of our race, in fact. They were even worse than the foreigners, and that, in Tiberias, required some small effort, shall we say. But as for me, as for my lecherous, drunken little imitation Helene, I'd become by then. Tiberias suited me perfectly. In a way, it prepared me for Rome, since several Roman ladies, wives of the procurators, officers bored with Caesarea, or rather tired of the reasonable degree of circumspection they had to maintain there, flocked to Tiberias that spring on the pretext of taking the curative waters at nearby Emmaus. Before then, I'd believed that women submitted their bodies to their husbands and their lovers out of love, a desire to have children, duty, a simple, good-hearted willingness to please their men. I had never before, not even in Athens, where even the hetairai make a great show of modesty, met women who were rutting bitches in eternal heat, which was what those patrician matrons were. I've often wondered why. It is not a normal thing. Now and again among us, as among all races, you find a woman who is a prey to the demon or the sickness of lust. But it is a sickness, and very rare. I think nature protects women from perpetual pregnancy by making them slow to passion, requiring more patience and more art to kindle than the average man can summon up. But among the Roman dames, that sickness was epidemic. I think now that it was but a symptom of the wrath soon to fall upon that impious race, whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. I was not uncomely. In Tiberias, I had a different adulterous bedfellow almost every night, which, as I said before, prepared me for Rome. What it didn't prepare me for was Helvetia. I have told you that no pious Jew could enter Tiberias because Antipas had defied one of our sternest laws by building it above a necropolis, a city of the dead. But there was one who could, because his piety was not of the law, because it stood above and beyond any law, and hence nothing could profane it. I mean, of course, my brother, my friend, my dearest love, my cruelest foe, Yeshua ben Yosef, called Ha-Notzri. He came into my lodgings at the worst of all possible moments, for that night I was entering a group of my swinish friends, entertaining them in Roman fashion, which is to say, most swinishly. Yeshua stood there in the doorway, and his nostrils twitched with pure disgust. His gaze swept over the entwined naked forms close coupled, in many cases without due regard for natural gender, on the benches, on the floor, across the banquet table itself, and returned to my face. I wasn't at the moment participating in the general rut. Instead, With vine leaves in my hair, I was plucking insanely at my lyre and chanting a scholia, a drinking song of my own composition, whose lightest, least offensive word could have caused my Uncle Hezron to wash my mouth out with wood ashes and slacked lime. "Nathan," he said, and my soul shriveled up within me. I followed him out into the night. We walked together along the lake shore, northward in the direction of Migdal Nunaya. He didn't say anything to me, not anything at all. He didn't have to. It wasn't even necessary. Just his being there was enough. To my reeling, drunken mind, all the stars of heaven gathered above his head and shed a soft radiance over him. It seemed to me his face, so like and so different from my own, glowed in the darkness, and the sadness in it was a reproach past all bearing, making words useless, a reduction of meaning, a hurtful cacophony that nonetheless I had to resort to in order to break through the crushing weight, the intensely painful flagellation of his silence. "Yeshua," I babbled, then the brine and bile in my throat, a whole Dead Sea of stinging salt behind my eyes, both choked and blinded me. Yeshua turned to me, then put out his strong, sun-browned, work-hardened hand. Let it rest upon my shoulder. "Go and sin no more, Nathan," he said. That was all. Then he was gone. I don't know when or even how he left me. It seemed to my drink-dulled senses that the stars went out, winked out one by one in awful silence, and that the night opened up and swallowed him. I remember that I was crying. "Oh, Yeshua, Yeshu, Yeshu." Then nothing at all. Neither time nor place, nor even tears. An instant later, I was lying on the beach, lapped by soft and fragrant waters, and the sun was in my eyes, like a host of red-hot spears. I got up from there and staggered home. My guests were all fast asleep, still limb entwined. The whole place smelled like a lupanar, a brothel. It stunk of carnality, of rut, with certain corporalatic variations produced by the activities of the sodomites. I went back into the streets, the nausea, the disgust in me bottomless. I wondered about Tiberias all day. When I came home at dusk, they'd gone. How long did my mood of repentance last? 4 days, I'd say. Perhaps a week. No more. Because, you see, he hadn't begun his mission then, and to elevate me out of swinehood into virtue, he would have had to command me to leave all else and follow him. I should have done it, of course, without question and at once, as all those whom he had afterward gave that order did. But I do think that I never really recovered my taste for and delight in debauchery after that. My sins took on the curious perversity of being in themselves a kind of punishment, since now I had almost to force myself into them in my wild, blind, stupid efforts to do what I, who have now lived close to 90 years, know beyond all questioning is impossible, to escape him. To flee Yeshua's, the Nazarene. To do that, I shall have to die. And even then, I wonder. And I believe it was precisely my fear of him, no, not of him exactly, but rather of that high and terrible road along which I dimly perceived, he was already beckoning to me to follow him. That stony path which would dizzily up among the lofty peaks of purity, of virtue, to plunge at the last into the dark valley of self-sacrifice that made the very thought of having to leave Tiberias send a shudder of terror through me. Because I was soon going to have to depart that capital of perfumed vice, the hometown of every variety of perversion and diseased imagination can invent. For the simplest of all possible reasons, my father, at the urging of Uncle Hezron, had cut off my allowance in order to force me to return to either one of my two homes, which meant I'd have to settle down as a gentleman farmer upon my uncle's place, or go to work in my grandfather's counting house in Jerusalem. Neither prospect pleased me. Not so much because of the work involved, I have never really been lazy, but because of the stern supervision of my personal life I'd be obliged to submit to. I was almost down to my last denaries when a means of escape was offered me. The Tetrarch, Herod Antipas, announced a series of games in honor of both his imperial patron, Tiberius Caesar, and the goddess Flora Primavera, she who rules the spring, to be held in the local stadium. Now I have always been fleet of foot, largely because my small stature made running away the only course open to me, since all the boys of my age were far bigger and stronger than I was, thus affording me much practice and a convincing motive for excelling at foot racing. So I entered my name as a competitor in the long race, and desperately started in to train away the torpor and the fat my slothful, lecherous existence had inflicted upon me. It wasn't the prize that interested me, really, for it was far too small to solve my economic problems, but rather the tremendous amount of money I could win through bets judiciously placed, through agents, of course, and secretly, upon the outcome of the race. The only trouble was that I could never hope to cover them if I lost, and therefore risk being sold into slavery if my father or my uncle failed to come to my rescue in such unhappy case. Wait, let me put this in its proper perspective. The long race wasn't the main event. The chariot races scheduled for the next day were. But the unsavory collection of degenerates and swine who were Tiberius's citizens would bet on which leg a dog would hoist to wet a tree, so the importance of the event didn't matter. By the evening before the start of the games, there was almost as much money riding on my close-cropped pate as there was upon Marcos, the leading charioteer for the Greens. And I played it cunningly. I let myself be seen in my usual haunts, swilling wine, gay, laughing, pinching every patrician female rump I passed. But that wine had been on my secret orders watered until the color was almost gone. I slept long hours during the day, added a stade to the distance I ran each dawn, lived, while seeming not to, the life of an Essene monk. My competitors were utterly deceived. They didn't train at all. When I turned into the last lap, I wasn't even breathing hard. Looking back over my shoulder, I saw Yonahan bar Talmay a few paces behind me. He was covered with sweat and his face was distorted with pain. I looked down and saw why. The fool who always called himself Ihanus Bartolomeus had himself operated upon to restore some semblance of a foreskin, so that the spectators would not think him, why he, who swore by the whole pantheon of pagan gods he was no Jew, had in fact been circumcised. He'd remembered too late that we ran stark naked, the half-healed surgery had burst, a stream of blood covered his muscular thighs. The laughter that tore me caused me to miss my stride. Despite his pain, he overtook me, came abreast. I paced myself, let him draw ahead, then 20 paces or less from the goal, I started to run as though this were the 1 stadia race instead of the 24 stadies we had already covered. My sight blurred, the stands, the great red velvet draperies before the judges' box, the whole circuit itself, swam into unreality with my speed. The spectators came to their feet, racking sound out of existence with their roars. When I crossed the finish line, I was utterly alone. Bending there, fighting for breath, trying to draw air into my tortured lungs, I saw why. 15 paces back, poor Jonahan lay on the track, writhing in awful agony. I whirled, ran back to him, picked him up, leaped aside with him, just as the close-packed runners, whom he and I had left nearly 2 whole stadies behind, came thundering around the bend. I probably saved his life, for surely they would have trampled him. I bore him in my arms up to the stands, laid him down, raised my hands towards Antipas, toward the burly centurion at his side, Helvetia's father. I didn't know that then. Ave Tetrarch, Ave O respective of glorious Caesar. I panted in what was for Galilee very nearly flawless Latin. I beg of you to divide the prize between him who, had he not fallen, might have won, and me. Why? I have an antique humor, and our rulers like such gestures. The prize was small, 1,000 sesterces. I'd gain 40 times that much in wagers won. And my empty half-mocking gesture served me better than I knew, for it convinced my Helvetia, whom up until that moment I had not even seen, that I was the best, the noblest of men. Antipas smilingly motioned me to mount the winner's dais. Half fainting, poor Jonahan stood beside me. I kept a hard grip on his arm to keep him from falling. He looked up at me with the dumb, grateful eyes of a wounded dog. Then the heavens opened, and she came down. Wait, what does a man see when he looks for the first time on the woman whom afterward he comes to love? Not the reality, surely, not the woman who is there, but a distortion, a heightening, an image of some degree false, created by the shock of recognition at perceiving his desire, his need, fleshed out into a form, a face he has known always in his heart of hearts, without knowing how or why, or even that he knew. Therefore, description is useless. My Roman mistress, Lydia, swore that Helvetia resembled nothing so much as a small white mouse. Even discounting female malice, she wasn't entirely wrong. But I saw a mist of sunlight on spring snow, a mouth the palest pink of roses, eyes the color of a Tishri sky. You see? A man describing the woman he loves makes bad poetry, falsifies always, is ridiculous. Say Helvetia was a tiny pale blonde girl who was moderately pretty. Will you accept that? It's a lie. She was the most beautiful thing who ever drew the breath of mortal life. Don't expect truth of me. I give you Pilate's question. To me, truth is that she was Aphrodite, new risen from the foam and quality of tenderness. all the loveliness there was. To Lydia, she was an albino mouse, which is also truth, I suppose. As she came toward me, I could see a deep violet vein beating in the base of her alabaster throat. Her skin was that fine, that transparent. I stared at her so hard, so rudely, that a tide of color rose in her face. Your name, Victor?" she faltered. "Nathan Bar Yehuda," I said loudly, then more quietly, "and from this hour forth your slave." She put the laurel wreath upon my head, turned and kissed my sweaty cheek, so lightly that most her lips seemed not to touch. I have lived 60 years since that day. I've been beaten, tortured, taken wounds, been baked by desert winds, seared by brazen suns, but I'll carry the feel of that kiss with me down to my grave. She crowned poor Yonahan, too, but she didn't kiss him. As she turned to go, I gasped at her out of the depths of my anguish. Tonight, in the gardens of the palace, even if it cost me my life. She looked at me over her shoulder. Her face was Aurora's. Her Tishri eyes opened very wide. "You mustn't," she whispered. "The soldiers, my father's men, they'll—" "I'll be there," I said. I was. I climbed the garden wall, swung down into the fragrant dark. The garden was filled with olive trees. I could hear the Roman soldiers clanking about their rounds each time they came near me. I froze into tree shadow, vanished into night. Then a door opened, and she came. The moon was high. I could see her clearly. I stood there, unbreathing. The sight of so much loveliness was a kind of death. She peered this way and that, her face taut with anxiety in the moonlight. Though I knew it not, I had already won. But my experience with the hetairai of Athens, the patrician dames from her own country, had taught me to be bold. When she was close enough, I reached out and dragged her into my arms. "Nathan," she hissed, "you must go. You must. The soul—" By then I had found her mouth. She tore free at last. I could see the tears on her face. But she didn't reproach me. They'll kill you," she breathed. "My father will order you crucified." "Will you come and watch me die, Helvetia?" I said, for already I have found out her name. Helvetia, daughter of the centurion Helvetius Helvetia, Gallic rose, angel of my delight. "Oh," she wailed, "for you I'll do it well," I said. "I'll make you proud of me, and when you're very old you can tell your grandchildren. A man died for me once, Nathan Bar Yehuda, a Jew. He died very well. At the last moment he looked into my eyes and smiled." "Oh, but you're mad," she said. "Go, Nathan, go now, while the soldiers are still on the other side, and you—" I shook my head. "Don't you want me to die?" I said. "No!" she gasped. "Oh, immortal gods, Why not?" I said. "Oh, I don't know, Nathan, please." "Kiss me," I said. "Don't be a fool. The soldiers, "Kiss me." She stood there. Her face was very white. Her mouth trembled. Its quiver was the most enchanting sight I'd ever seen. If I do, will you go?" she said. "Yes." "No. Will you promise me another thing?" We heard then aloud in the night the clank of soldiers' armor. "Yes, yes, anything. Only go," she moaned. "You will walk by the lake shore tomorrow, very early, northward in the direction of Migdal Nunaya. Alone. Will you do that?" "Nathan, I can't. You know I can't. My father—" I smiled at her sadly, leaned languidly back against the tree. "Then on your head be my death," I said. "Go!" She was really crying now. "I'll come. Only go! I grinned at her, perfectly at ease. You still haven't kissed me, I said. Her lips were ice cold, trembling salt at first, but I warmed them. I kissed her with a wicked accumulation of skill. I was still molding, cherishing her mouth, when the soldiers came. I saw them just in time, dragged her into the olive shadow. The clanking stopped. I could have sworn I saw one of them growled. Some wench letting a slave scullion pry her knees apart. So did I. Vulcanus, Eros, and Aphrodite aid and say, I grant him a stout weapon, and her a tight sheath. We're supposed to protect his Jewish nibs and our captain, aren't we? And a couple of busy belly bumpers ain't got harming nobody in their little lusty heads, so come on. But there was another danger. I could hear Vulcanus' breath rasp. Kind of like to see it, he muttered. Never have, Lucius. Seen another couple, I mean. Take you down to Cyrus Lupiner tomorrow, and have him stage a circus for you. Men, women, dogs, goats, and jackasses. But right now, I don't aim to have to pull you off some Jew bitch who's screaming her head off. The old man's strict that way. We make our rounds. Vulcanus, tomorrow's our night off. Wait till then. I heard them clanking off and measured out my breath upon the dead-stopped air. Then I looked down. The tree in which we'd hid was very old and had put up many shoots, each one of them grown thicker than a man's body over the centuries, so that one olive had become a miniature forest in itself. It was too dark for me to see her, but I could feel the long, slow tremble, the desperate, hopeless way she cried. Helvetia, I said. What? They've spoiled it, she sobbed. I was so happy, Nathan. Then they opened their dirty mouths and spewed their filth all over. I stared toward that lovely face. I couldn't see. I had a problem on my hands, I realized. All over what? I said. This. She made a poem of motion with her white hand, encompassing the garden, the moonlight, the magic of that moment gone. All this loveliness. Over us? You know what's the most beautiful word on earth? Us? Oh, God, The next morning, even though I arrived by boat at the very crack of dawn, she was already there, before me, waiting very quietly on the golden beach beside the wine-dark sea.